Kremlin is doing a really, really phenomenal job at trying to hide and misinterpret a lot of the casualties and the true cost of this war on the Russian people. Um, some of the ways that they do it is number one, by offering insane amounts of compensation to families of deceased servicemen, going after veterans and providing them with like jobs, and making sure that they're integrated into the Russian society. All of these factors are very important to track because what the Kremlin is essentially doing is avoiding the Afghanistan situation. And what I mean by Afghanistan syndrome situation is when thousands of former conscripts that were forced to go fight in Afghanistan returned, to already decaying Soviet Union that was facing a lot of economic challenges.
Now, I'm a former military planner and have planned these sorts of operations. One of the things that you can do when you're in a defense in defense, which Ukraine is on the Eastern Front, is you trade space for time. Now, if you're trading space for time and you do nothing with it, you're just giving up territory. But actually, if you look at what Ukraine's doing, it's decimating the Russian stormtroopers. It's causing huge casualties, both in personnel terms, but equipment terms. And it's also buying time for more operational level actions in attacking Russian defense industry, airfields, assassinating generals, logistic supply chains, and everything else. And therefore, from a planning perspective, I think Ukraine is making best use of that time by tying the Russians up at the tactical level on the Eastern Front. And they may have to give a little bit of territory. But actually, when you put it into context from Russia's immediate actions in its illegal full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Ukraine's taken most of the territory back that Russia, or a large percentage of it back, and Russia is nowhere near occupying the territory it did at the beginning. Am I sort of right in my thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Ukraine was able to repel Russian full-scale attack on Kyiv. That attack aimed to capitulate Ukrainian government, to essentially install a Russian puppet state without having to fight for Ukraine, essentially. That had failed because Ukrainian forces were prepared and Ukrainian forces were able to repel that attack on Kyiv, on its capital. In terms of, Russia is trying to make these marginal gains, and I think their theory of victory in Ukraine is just outlasting Ukraine, and most importantly, outlasting Western support. Because a crucial component in Ukraine's resistance is Western support. Ukraine had ramped up its defense industrial base production. It's improving and innovating its drones, but there's some things that Ukraine still relies on for Western support, in particular air defense systems, which are proving to be crucial day in and day out, as we see the recent strikes on Kyiv, on Rivne, and so on. So the Russian strategy here is they don't really care if they have to make these marginal gains, if they have to sacrifice thousands and thousands of Russians, if they have to give up more divisions full of, tanks and so on, which is kind of what they did for the Battle of Pokrovsk, which effectively culminated at this point. They don't really care because it's the optics. It's creating the optics that Russia can do this and can outlast and can keep making this sort of marginal progress, while we ourselves here in the West can't support Ukraine full all the time, in an effort to prioritize our own objectives or so on. That's the play here. I think the theory of victory lies within affecting the center of gravity, which the center of gravity for this war lies within London, Washington D.C. It's not on the battlefield.
Yeah, well, people who analyze the battlefield and try and work out who's winning or losing by just looking at how much a front line has moved are very naive indeed. The Americans turned around at the end of the Vietnam War and declared that they hadn't lost a single tactical battle. When the Viet Cong turned around and said, "So what?" It wasn't them that won. Now, we're approaching a milestone for the Russians because they're losing between 1,000 and 1,400 troops a day, either dead or severely wounded. And most of the wounded, I've seen reports today, do not get good medical treatment and end up dying. this week we will hit probably tomorrow. I suspect tomorrow 1 million Russian casualties. That's according to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense analysis. Now, the first question is, from an ISW perspective, your reports always come across to me as very balanced and very full of detail. Where do you get your detail from? How long does it take to produce the daily reports? And how do you get through the plethora of disinformation that's coming out from both sides for very obvious reasons?
Those are wonderful questions. I mean, I think it's part of our methodology to look at not just Ukrainian sources, but also deeply analyze Russian sources, as well as use commercially available satellite imagery and for to make the best kind of assumption forecast that we can based on the information available in open source. We're very, very committed to maintaining that open source intelligence tradecraft because we were able to show that there's plenty of information in the information space that you can corroborate, that you can explain, that you can compare and kind of analyze. I think that we often have this assumption that just because the Russian, just because the Kremlin controls the information space in Russia, that means that there's no civil society that exists or no presence, online that can be analyzed and looked deeply into. And that's not true because we actually saw a rise of what we call the Russian military bloggers, mil bloggers, who are this pro-war community who essentially are writing for the Russian servicemen and their families and the volunteer efforts, crowdfunding efforts want to continue this war. And they've actually not only categorized the battlefield in enormous detail, they also have provided us with some insights into how the Russian military looks like on the inside, right? How are they're restructuring their drone units? How are they in terms of supplies on certain parts of the front line? So these are the things that kind of make up the picture altogether. And we have a wonderful team. Our team keeps on growing, and we're as the team keeps on growing, we can process more information and look for more insights.
One that I'm going to put out to the audience is that people think that the only good intelligence is stuff that's classified, at the highest levels. Believe me, I've seen intelligence at the highest levels. Open source intelligence is as good, if not in many cases better than what you get from classified sources. That's just my little rant on it. It's interesting though. You say that the Russian mill bloggers are putting out there. Surely the Russians know that they're giving away detail that can be exploited by the Ukrainians. And as we reach this 1 million casualties milestone, do you think the Russian people are going to realize that, and what sort of effect is that going to have on them?
I think the Kremlin is doing a really, really phenomenal job at trying to hide and misinterpret a lot of the casualties and the true cost of this war on the Russian people. Um, some of the ways that they do it is number one, by offering insane amounts of compensation to families of deceased servicemen, going after veterans and providing them with like jobs, and making sure that they're integrated into the Russian society. All of these factors are very important to track because what the Kremlin is essentially doing is avoiding the Afghanistan situation. And what I mean by Afghanistan syndrome situation is when thousands of former conscripts that were forced to go fight in Afghanistan returned, to already decaying Soviet Union that was facing a lot of economic challenges. They weren't able to find, they didn't get state benefits and they didn't get that level of integration necessary. And so, what the Kremlin is actively doing right this and is spending copious amount of money to appease people, and it's working because we are not seeing a mass movement of wives right now that is emerging across all Russian regions. We're not seeing that, and there's a reason for this. And I think one of the main reasons is the compensation and the level of states' prioritization of making sure that the regime remains stable. There's other factors also. Of course, censorship is huge. The Russian government classifies nearly everything as going against the Russian military or vilifying Russian military, even if it's a fair critique. Um, they have applied that tactic specifically towards the families and relatives of Russian servicemen. Not so much to some mill bloggers, but mostly the servicemen and their families. And that's an important kind of factor in making a lot of people being silent and not speaking out their truth. Um, Now, can the Kremlin sustain this forever? I don't think so. Personally, I think that this is a tremendous financial cost that the Kremlin will have to face, not just in the short term, but it's also a long-term commitment. You have to pay pensions. You have to pay all of the promised compensations forever for these people. And the Russian government keeps on relying on these obscene compensations to recruit more people. And I think that eventually Russia might find a situation in which it will need to drop those promises and resort to the old style Soviet kind of Red Army conscription mobilization model, or it's not going to be able to sustain that level of appeasement that they're currently doing right now.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you want to get access to exclusive content, please sign up for Times Radio membership and subscribe. Right, 3, 2, 1. You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.